Hello, everyone. My name is Paula Neves, and I'm the lead for the Center for Living Organ Donation. I'd like to welcome you all to this session on expressive writing. We know that telling our stories is very important for health, and today's session is really an opportunity for all of us to hear about how storytelling, how writing contributes to our health and can assist us in our journey. And we'll hear a little bit of research on this topic, and also we'll go through some writing exercises. We're very fortunate to be joined today by Dr. Sharon Bray, who's an educator, an author, a therapeutic writing practitioner. And for the past 21 years, she has encouraged and listened to people's stories of cancer, cardiac disease, heart failure, and today, living donation and transplantation. Sharon earned her master's degree at Mount St. Vincent University and later completed a PhD at the University of Toronto. She initiated her first expressive writing group for cancer patients shortly after her own treatment for early stage breast cancer. And she went on to publish 2 books describing her early work in this area. We're very, very fortunate to have Sharon with us today to talk about the health benefits of expressive writing for patients and caregivers, and to start us on our own writing and storytelling and healing journey. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Sharon Bray.
Thank you, Paula. And I'm delighted that so many of you actually signed up for yet another virtual encounter. And today, I much prefer, I will say, the face-to-face interactions I always have. So Paula is helping me out. You'll hear me say periodically, next slide. She's going to take care of that because very often when I've tried to do all of these things at once, being, let's just say, more used to pen and paper and in person, Zoom, as much as they've made it easy, is not always easy for me, but I'm delighted to see you. Today, we're going to be talking about many different things by way of adding to Paula's introduction. This is work that I continue to do. I started it 21 years ago. I've led many workshops for cancer patients. And when I returned to Canada, I was fortunate enough to get Heather Ross as my cardiologist at the Peter Munk Center at UHN. I was diagnosed with heart failure after a few years after my treatment for breast cancer. And it turns out that we know a lot more today than we did then about the detrimental effects of some of the treatments we have for serious conditions like cancer and the havoc they wreak on the body, even though they are helping us to overcome illness. Here's the roadmap for today. We're going to talk about the definition of expressive writing, what it is, how it started, why it's important, why it's healing, and in what ways, in particular, the research has shown us that it is healing. I'm going to offer you 3 opportunities to write. Don't be shy. You don't have to ever share your writing out loud in one of my workshops, not ever. But of course, I always hope that 1 or 2 people will. But I'll give you 3 short writing exercises to give you the experience of what it would be like to be writing with an expressive writing group leader. We're going to talk about how can you write yourself for health benefits, whether alone or in the company of others. Twice during the session, I'll ask for questions because you may have questions as I go along. So if you do have questions, just send them to the chat box. And about midway through, we'll stop. I'll answer as many questions as I can. And then again, right at the end, I'll give another chance to answer more questions as we go along. So that's our landscape, and let's get started. Next slide, please. What do we know about writing? Well, it all started about 30 years ago. Writers have known a lot about what writing does for oneself, our great works of fiction, of poetry, of all the bodies of literature out there. But in terms of scientifically, does it do anything for us? Well, it all began with a fellow name of James Pennebaker. Jamie's a psychologist, now emeritus at the University of Texas in Austin. And he was going through a difficult time early in his marriage and depression. And one of the things he did to help himself deal with that period of difficulty was to write. And he felt better after he wrote. And so, being a researcher, he got interested in actually finding out if there was some evidence for why we feel better when we write. And so he decided to do a study. And this was about 30 years ago, college students at the University of Texas. He had them in two groups. One, a control group. That's the group that just got the instructions to write for 15 minutes a day about anything. Didn't matter what class you had, the food you ate, a movie you went to, anything. The other group, the experimental group, was told to write for 15 minutes a day for 4 days, like the other group, but to write about the most upsetting or most traumatic events in their lives. And so the experiment progressed. At the end of it, they looked at it immediately, but again at the end of the school year. And what happened over the period of time from the study was quite interesting. For the control group, there weren't any changes. Life went on as it always had. They went to the health center as many times as they always had. Nothing changed. And when asked about the writing experiment, that was sort of like, we just wrote. But the group, the experimental group that had to write about trauma, a number of things happened. For the first point, they said that that experience of writing had been very, very important to them, very meaningful. And the second is they had fewer doctor visits, fewer visits to the campus health center, fewer illnesses. And Pennebaker decided he was onto something. And since then, it's been called expressive writing. And what we know, thanks to James Pennebaker, is that writing about these traumatic experiences produce changes, good changes in physical and mental health. And they also affect sleep habits, work efficiency, and the way we interact with others. That was pretty fantastic. And so the research began. And in the past 30 years, there have been dozens and dozens and dozens of studies. So he gave it a name. Next slide. It was called expressive writing. And here's the definition. What expressive writing is, it's about writing thought about the thoughts and feelings that you have when you have had an upsetting, a stressful, a traumatic life event. It's writing where you don't ever have to worry about those things your English teacher tried to tell you. Form, spelling, punctuation, verb agreement. Who cares? Nobody's going to see it. So you have the complete freedom to write freely, any way you want. All expressive writing does is it expresses what's in your mind and what's in your heart. And the research studies have shown that it has many, many positive health benefits. Next slide. But let me stop here and ask a question, because of course you don't get a chance to introduce yourself to everybody, but I want to think about the way that we think about ourselves before and after a traumatic event, before a diagnosis of a serious illness and after. And what I go to is Walt Disney's wonderful version of Alice in Wonderland, and that delightful caterpillar on his giant mushroom, smoking his hookah. And as Alice tumbles down into this strange place called Wonderland, she encounters the caterpillar. And he asks, "But who are you?" And Alice says, I hardly know, sir, at present. At least I knew who I was this morning. Well, I love this slide. I love this quote because it's a little bit how it feels to be one day, as I did, Sharon Bray, walking up the street with my dog and passing out on the pavement, coming to consciousness Dog still with me, hand in leash, walking home thinking, what just happened? I fainted. Calling my husband at work, never used to do that. But for some reason I did. I said, I'm just headed out to a meeting, but I thought I should tell you I passed out when I was walking Maggie. Go call your doctor, he said. I said, I just saw her 2 days ago. I had a physical. I'm fine. I'm ready. I'm going. I cut my chin, but hey, I've got a meeting. And then I said, uh-oh, and I passed out again. When I came to the next time, the phone was ringing and I was rushed off to the hospital. Of course, I said, don't come, please. She said, EMTs are on their way. And I said, I'm standing up. I'm fine. Well, thankfully they came. 6 of them, gorgeous, handsome, young EMTs, ripping my shirt open and going through the whole thing. And the next thing I knew, I was in the emergency room and then put in observation for 3 days. And I did not know what had happened or why it had happened or why it had happened to me. But I knew one thing for sure. Everything had changed in that moment. And so I want you to think about this, and I'm going to give you a short writing exercise. So next slide, Paula, here's what I'd like you to do. You've got a paper and pen handy, you'll need it, or a computer. And I'd like you to, and if you're on your iPhone, well, type it into your message. But I'd like you to make a list. 2 columns, if you like. I used to be blank, but now I'm blank. So think of yourself before and after your diagnosis, before and after the transplant, before and after you became a donor, all of those different things that are part of the experience of being in the world of living organ transplant. I used to be, but now. I'm only going to give you 3 minutes, so write as fast as you can, okay? Go. And you have 1 more minute. And wherever you are, start to finish up with your last I used to be, but now. Okay, let's stop. Now, normally in my expressive writing groups, at any time, actually, there's never a requirement to read. You never, ever, ever have to read. But invariably, in our group workshops, people do. And the more that we do the sessions, the more they read. And it's extraordinary what happens when people share what has been written out of this whole process. So my question is, would anybody be brave enough to read what they've written just now? If you can let us know by unmuting yourself and saying, I will, and then we can see you. Anyone like to share what you've written?
I'm okay with it. It's Janet.
Great. Janet, please go ahead.
My list isn't extensive, but
Doesn't have to be.
I used to be really sick, and now I am healthy. I used to be really tired, and now I'm energetic. I used to be really sad, and now I'm feeling better. I used to be withdrawn, and now I'm becoming more open. I used to be self-focused, and now I'm more outward. I used to not know how to talk to friends, and now I do. I used to be casual about my health, and now I'm more aware.
Janet,
I'm a transplant recipient.
you're a recipient. Thank you for clarifying that. I sort of imagined you were as you were reading. I have to say I got chills while you were talking. Just to look back on what was and what is now, and it's the simplest writing exercise can bring the most powerful response from your listeners, but also it's so interesting what always comes up. Thank you for reading. Would anyone else like to read what they've written?
Yes. Hi,
Great.
I'm Carl. Yes, I'm Carl Hicks Sr. The reason I had to put the senior there is my son, he's also on here as well too. He's junior.
Oh.
Yeah, and and I tell you, I learned he's into spiritual care. He works at UHN part-time.
Fabulous.
And let me tell you, listen, when my kidneys failed, he actually had to rent a wheelchair, put me in that wheelchair, take me to Toronto General Hospital because I couldn't walk. I was actually in the kitchen preparing some oysters that he got for me, and I collapsed.
Can you read what you've written?
Yes, yeah.
Please
and
do.
so what I've got in there is that I didn't care too much about let's see now.
Just go ahead and read it.
Yeah,
We're sort of pressed for time.
Yeah, I would say I didn't care too much about tomorrow's health, you might say. I didn't care about how a seed would grow, like a tomato seed.
Yes.
He got me this growing kit, indoor plant growing kit, and it fascinated me after the surgery just to see how this grows from start to finish. And it created a tremendous new respect for life.
Wonderful.
You see,
Wonderful.
And I have a whole bunch of stuff that I scribbled down, but I think I'll be taking up too much time.
Okay, Carl, I really appreciate this, but I love that. I love the analogy, actually, even though it's more than analogy, of the tomato plant.
Yeah.
And how you learned something from that. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you. And so let's move on. Next slide, please, Paula. So what happened? Well, Pennebaker's original research spawned study after study after study, dozens and dozens and dozens, and again and again and again, what was confirmed is that writing was much more powerful for healing, for health benefits than anyone had imagined. And it was really groundbreaking research. Since that time, studies have been done with many, many different populations. Arthritis, people suffering from arthritis, heart patients, cancer patients, war veterans. The great writer Maxine Hong Kingston works with veterans from the Vietnam and Afghanistan wars. And their stories, as you can imagine, are terrible, some of them, terrible horrors that they witnessed. Her only rule to those folks was tell the truth. Write about that. Tell me that painful story. And extraordinarily healing. So war veterans have been a big recipient audience of this. Children, they discovered early on that blogging for kids, writing and communicating with their friends also had health benefits out of sick kids' hospitals and so on. People suffering from PTSD, studies were done. People with other illnesses like the Epstein-Barr virus, for example, the fatigue syndrome. None that I know of have been done with transplant recipients, but nevertheless, so many studies are still being done, even today, 30 years later, because it's amazing what they keep uncovering. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And writing for healing has made the popular literature. It's gone from the research studies to books and books and books on Amazon and bookstores about writing and healing, journaling, to articles in magazines, health magazines, the New York Times. It's out in the public domain. There are offshoots too. In the UK, something's very popular that's beneficial and what do I want to say, conducive to expressive writing, but it's called bibliotherapy. Groups meet to discuss literature that's related to their own condition and experience. And that becomes a therapeutic exercise to see how what they experience is also represented in literature. There's a whole organization called Poetry Therapy. Well, maybe they need to label it. I'm a great poetry lover. What do poets write of? The human condition, the suffering, the heartache, the way of expressing it is what poetry is all about. And journal therapy, writing alone, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Just using the journal for that therapeutic writing. And there's a way to do that, and we'll talk about that. And finally, it also fostered people like me who've been through the hospital a few times to start taking what I used to do with creative writing when I taught creative writing and start focusing on writing groups for people going through difficult illness and experiences. And that's what I've been doing for the last many years. Okay, next slide. So what are the major health benefits of expressive writing? There are some that are pretty constant throughout all the different populations. For starters, there's an improved quality of life. What does that mean? Well, I know that writing for me has become a daily habit, and sometimes I use it to spill what's going on with me that is emotional and difficult or hard to understand or upsetting. The simple act of releasing it means I start the day feeling better. I always end the day with a few notes of gratitude in my notebooks. I always start the day feeling better. But it also showed results in improving mental and physical health. Expressive writing, writing therapy, if you like, has a lot of things in common with what we call talk therapy. And our physical health is very affected by what's going on mentally as well. And expressive writing has improved both. It has lowered, particularly important in patients with hypertension, blood pressure and heart rate. For some diseases, like Epstein-Barr, it improved the immune system functioning. Cancer patients report after expressive writing groups and experiences better sleep, easing of pain, and even feeling different about one's illness. Not that you're going to wave a magic wand called an ink pen and it goes away, but rather a perspective of who you are and how you're handling that illness. That also is a health benefit that emerges in expressive writing studies. And what else does it do? Next slide. It goes beyond the emotional. It goes beyond the physical and also includes cognitive and emotional benefits. For starters, illness, serious illness, silences us for a time. We're in shock, we're upset, it's unreal, we're living in a universe we didn't plan to be part of. And so that trauma, that silence, when you do this kind of writing, it helps you reclaim the voice that is not dominated by illness and trauma. It's a process, if you like, of rediscovering the self. It does a very important cognitive thing. When we're diagnosed with serious illness, when we're given bad news, when we have sudden loss, our voice, in essence, are silenced. The emotions are so strong and so overpowering. What writing does for us is it helps us translate the chaos of emotion into things that we can understand, into words. We have a way of expressing them. It helps us make connections, and this is really important. Why am I feeling the way I do? Because this happened. And sometimes because this happened is something that isn't immediately apparent, but writing can take us there and help us connect what we're feeling with the upsetting events that have happened to us. Writing helps us develop insight and greater self-understanding into our own complex self. And the other thing it does, and I'll talk a little bit more about this as we go along too, it can help you reclaim and rediscover your creativity, also silenced in the initial stages of living with a serious illness. I've had many people from my writing groups go on to write poetry, do things, amazing expressions of their illness with art, write memoir. It's been extraordinary to see what blossoms creatively out of the illness experience. And writing also helps you remember who you were then. Joan Didion, the famous writer who died recently, talked about her writing and said, I write because it helps me remember who I was then. To capture the stories of your life, what's happened to you and why it mattered. It's very, very important. Writing can also benefit the doctor-patient relationship. Why? Because you make your fears, your feelings, your questions visible to yourself as you write. And thus, when you go to see your physician, you are better equipped to explain yourself, ask the questions. It can enhance communication. And I'll give you an example. One of my cancer writers from several years ago was living with stage 3 cancer, and she knew that sooner or later, given the kind of cancer it was going to become stage 4. But she was doing well, at least she thought she was. And she came to the group one day in tears. And I gave, and she talked about it before we started the writing group, and said that she had been given the bad news, that her doctor told her that her time was up. She had 2 or 3 months left to live, and there was nothing more to be done. She'd expected this, but what upset her was the way in which her doctor conveyed the news. That afternoon, I had already planned an exercise called the unsent letter. And I imagine some of you have written angry or upsetting letters to people that you've never sent. Turns out it's a pretty powerful exercise. And the task is to write a letter to someone that you will never send, they will never see. It gives you the freedom to put anything on the page. And so she wrote, and at the end of the exercise, when I said, would anyone like to read? Would anyone like to share what they've written? She shared what she wrote. And what she had written was a letter to her doctor and telling him how hurt she was when he told her the news. Not that it was stage 4, but that he was cold, he was impersonal, he wouldn't look at her, he turned away, he didn't talk to her afterwards. It was unlike anything she'd experienced from her oncologist for the full 10 years she'd been there, and it hurt. After she read, she said, I feel better, it's good to get it out. Well, we thought that was the end of that, but the next week she came into the writing group, all smiles. She said, I have to share something with you. She said, I didn't think I could do it, but I decided to take the letter into my doctor and read it to him. And that's what she did. And what happened is they reconnected. The friendship. He was warm. He apologized. He told her that it was so hard for him to give her that news that he had a hard time telling her. And he was at her side for the remaining couple of months that she lived. It was quite an extraordinary event. So let me stop here and just ask if there are any questions that you'd like to ask before we go on. And again, you can unmute yourself or send a note in chat, whatever.
Yeah, a few years ago, my dad had a stroke. This was actually 2006 to be exact. Eventually he passed away, but before that, he hung around for a bit. He couldn't remember his name, he couldn't write, etc., etc. And then what I did was I wrote out the alphabet, the whole alphabet from A to Z, and asked him to write each one. Of course, he couldn't write, he was writing like a 4-year-old. And do you know, his writing got better, and it got better. And it was amazing to see the transition. His doctor was also impressed.
Wonderful.
You know, so but you think that's part of what you're saying here, like how it can help us with recovery, with after a traumatic event?
I expect that it's part of the larger recovery from a traumatic event, like you're saying, Carl. Does it have anything to do with expressive writing? I couldn't say that it does. But if he got to the point where he could write relatively fluently again, then he could write about that experience, and that would come under the category of expressive writing. Okay.
Excellent. Okay, good to know.
Anyone have a question? Any other comment? Going once, twice. Okay, Paula, let's move on. Next slide. There we are. Whoops. Not there. I didn't think that we were there, but there it is. Okay, thank you so much. All right, quick recovery. All right. The one thing I did want to say is that while expressive writing research was fairly new and pretty significant, it's not new that writing is healing. And the people who know that best are writers. William Carlos Williams was a well-known physician, but also a poet. He wrote poetry, who lived in the late 1800s, late 1900s. But he said that's the way writing often starts, a disaster or a catastrophe. By writing, I rescue myself under all sorts of conditions. Think of it. I rescue myself by writing. Interesting way to put it. And Henry James, the great novelist, he said, and it's true, many writers begin writing from a port of pain, putting their deepest and most fearful feelings on paper, whether in diaries, journals, poetry, and stories. And that's about the human experience, because being human is tough. There are setbacks. There are tragedies that happen to us. There are losses, loss of love. There are debilitating illnesses. And it is the subject. If you look at your favorite novels, favorite fiction, poetry, nonfiction, memoir, what's it about? It's about that human condition, about love and loss and suffering and illness and trauma. And that's what we write about. And part of why we read those books, this is bibliotherapy then, is because it speaks to our experience. We find meaning in somebody else's words. But that's because writing is about capturing the human experience. The men and women who come to my writing groups are also writing from a port of pain. They're writing from heart transplant, cardiac disease, terminal cancer, late stage cancer, all kinds of cancer, cancers I've never heard of until they come to the group. And trying to unpack and understand that experience. And so as a group leader, I am forever humbled and inspired by what my group writers share with me about their lives. I'm privileged, really, to hear such heartfelt, intimate experience of what it means to be ill, what it means to have suffered a traumatic illness, disease, or loss. It's all about being human. And so that's where we begin in the writing groups. And very often the very first prompt in a writing group is to write about the moment, the event that changed the course of our lives, to start there when the doctor said, "I'm sorry, but you ... Okay. So let's go to another writing exercise. Paula, tell me something I can't forget. I often use lines from poetry as writing prompts in my groups, and this is from a poem by Tess Gallagher, who lives close to the Vancouver area. She wrote a wonderful poem called Each Bird Walking, and in it she asks her husband, the narrator asks her husband, to tell me something I can't forget. And her husband does. What he tells her about is washing his dying mother, the intimacy, giving her her last bath before she died, and how it affected him. And then the poet responds with, "That's enough. That's enough." We've all had experiences in life we can't forget. This line, if I were to respond to it in a group, I would probably go to a summer's night in Halifax almost 40 years ago. My daughters were young. They'd gone on summer holiday with their father to the family farm in Indiana. And I was behind taking summer school. And that night I was sitting out on the porch and the phone rang. And I rushed in to get it because I thought, oh, they might be calling. And they were. But they were each on a different line. One daughter, the oldest, was crying, "Mommy, mommy, mommy, come quick, come quick." And the younger daughter was saying, "Don't worry, mommy, the divers will get him. The divers will get him." and I went cold. What happened that night is my husband drowned in the lake at the family farm. And that death and its aftermath was probably the most significant traumatic experience I've ever had. And when I think about it, it's as real as that night. I can remember all those details. So I'd like you to tell me something you can't forget. Something you can't forget. A diagnosis, finding a donor, being a donor, any other experience in your life that sticks in your memory, something you can't forget. I'm going to give you a big whopping 4 minutes for this exercise. Ready? Go ahead. and start to bring it to a close. Finish the last sentence you're on. Okay, would anybody be willing to share what they have written? Someone who didn't read the last time. I have a comment from Donna, if you haven't seen it on the chat. She remarks that she has lost loved ones, but it was expected. She's had work changes, but gotten over it. Disappointments, but they don't last long. And maybe it's because of my faith and believing that everything has a purpose, she said. And I think it's different for all of us, but thank you for sharing that, Donna. Anyone like to read? Just unmute yourself.
It's Carl Hicks here. If anyone doesn't have anything, I'll squeeze mine in because this is my second or third time speaking. I don't want to take over the whole thing.
It looks like you're the only volunteer, Carl. So in the interest of time, if you'll read what you actually wrote. Were you able to write?
Yeah. Okay. What I did was I made it point form.
That's fine.
Yeah. And what it was the year 2006. Dad's sleeping over because we're going to celebrate Mother's Day the next day. I go to his door to wake him for breakfast, and I says, "No, let him sleep a little bit more," because my wife wasn't finished with the breakfast. I turn and I hear a thump, like someone fell on the floor. I open the bedroom door. Dad is face down on the bedroom floor. I picked him up, put him on the bed. I see his heart is not going, perform some CPR. The heart started. In the meantime, Carol is calling 911. 911 arrives, they did some more CPR and revive him enough to get him to the hospital, Markham Unionville Hospital. Anyways, so we get there and he hung around for a bit. We were able to get all the family members together. And he passed away the next morning. So it was the Monday morning he passed away. But get this, his passing away was the same day his mom died years ago. What are the chances? And it was also Mother's Day that year when his mother died. So it's something, I mean, people pass away every day. Family members we lose very often. But that one was a little different because grandma passed away the same time. Anyways,
Okay,
but you are
Carl,
so correct, and I'm glad I met you because
I want to thank you for this.
You brought something to me that even this, what happened in 2006, I don't know. It was like you brought something out when you mentioned your husband drowning.
May I use you as an example?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Okay,
yes.
It's all right, Carl.
Yes.
Actually, this is what's so interesting in the groups. People will share things that as you're writing them, you write them and you know, it's fine. But the minute you start to read them out loud.
Oh my God. Yes.
Let me finish. It's not uncommon that there are tears, not uncommon at all. And the most benign prompt can bring things up in people. And I always say to my writers, because they'll start to apologize for tears, never apologize. What this tells me is that you've struck gold. You've found something that probably you want to explore even more.
Oh, yes, indeed.
Okay. Thank you, Carl. I'm going to move on for the interest of time. That was beautiful. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay, Paula, next slide. Now, let me say, it turns out that there are differences in writing. Not every kind of writing is as healing as others. So what makes writing most healing? Well, I use the iceberg as the metaphor, because if you imagine, and this is a phony picture, of course, because you can't do a cross-section of an iceberg, no one has yet, because they're immense when you're on the surface of water and you see the size and the enormity of it. Oh, can you mute yourself, Carl? Thank you. You see how big it is, but the real size is beneath the waterline where you can't see it. It's the same in writing. The real story is not on the surface. It's not what you sometimes start with. The real story is hidden. It's deep. It's beneath the waterline. And so the most healing kind of writing is something that Pennebaker got interested in after all his other research. He started looking at the kind of wording, the kind of language, the kind of writing that seemed to have the most healing benefits. For starters, it's about writing deeply. I was teaching a class in memoir many years ago, and a man came in and said, I want to write a memoir about my father and his love of building, those finely beautiful sailing ships, so intricate and so on. He said he did it all his life, and that's what I want to write about. And of course, I say, okay. So the weeks went by, he would write, and of course, people would share parts of what they were writing. And every time he read about this, number one, the ships got pretty boring. But number two, there was an edge. There was something that wasn't being said. And I don't remember the prompt that I ended up giving them that night, but it cracked him open. The real story wasn't about his father's hobby. The real story was about the relationship between the father and son, and how the son felt all those years that his father never had time for him because his passion was the sailing ships. That was the real story. But it took a long time to break through the ice, if you'll pardon the extension of the metaphor, and find the real story. And so the most healing kind of writing, Pennebaker discovered, is when you write deeply. You get beneath the waterline. I tell my writers all the time, writing is a courageous act because it requires you to tell the truth, and that's hard. It requires you to get beneath the surface. The other thing that's important is to find words for your feelings, to words that describe the feelings. That also is more healing than just simply saying, I was angry. Well, what does anger feel like? What does anger experience like? That's what we want to know. To use detail and description. When I taught creative writing, I would often say to my class, show me, bring it to life, make me feel it, make me smell it, make me see it. Detail, detail, description. Another thing that's important in writing that is most healing is to find those connections between the event and what I feel, and see what that connection is. It's also important to use a balanced narrative. So healing writing isn't all positive, but it's not all negative either. A balanced narrative means you've got a bit of both. There are positive feelings and there are hard, tough, negative feelings. The voice is intimate in writing that is most healing. And it's useful very often to imagine you're writing to a close friend, someone you trust, who is your confidant, to establish the right tone. Even writing to yourself sometimes is a good way to think about it. And finally, and this is really important, The most healing kind of writing is when you create a story from your experience. Story, a beginning, a middle, an end, and why. Our stories are what is uniquely human. We've been using stories to make sense of the world, of ourselves, ever since we got language. Stories are the way that we understand and make sense of the world and what happens to us. Our legacies are stories. Jim Harrison said, "Death steals everything but our stories." Think about it. I think of my father. He died years ago from lung cancer. What do I remember about him? His stories. The stories that made me giggle, the bedtime stories, the stories about his childhood. That's how I remember my father. Stories are also the currency of medicine. You tell a story to the doctor about your symptoms, how you've been feeling, and all of these things. And in turn, the doctor tells you the story of what it is, why it is, possibilities, treatments, and so on. Now, there's a lot of work being done in medical training now with doctors to help them be sensitive to and listen to the patient's story. And one of the reasons for that is that the research has shown for years that the average time it takes before a doctor will interrupt a patient is 18 seconds. So stories, being able to tell them, but also what happens when we tell our own stories, we are better at listening to others. And Rita Sharon, who's a physician at Columbia University in New York, has been actively doing work in what she calls narrative medicine. And one of the things she gets the doctors to do in her courses is to write and tell their own stories. And it makes them better at hearing the patient's story. Okay, next slide. Now, can writing be harmful? Actually, some kind of writing can. The cautionary note is to avoid the rabbit hole. Well, what does that mean? Well, it's normal to feel sad, even cry after you've written about something sad and upsetting. It's quite normal. And people will apologize for tears. And in my groups, there's no apology needed. That's normal. That means you're getting somewhere. It's kind of like how you feel after you've seen a sad film. It doesn't last. But the rabbit hole is something else. And I'll give you my own example. In the aftermath of my husband's death, I filled notebook after notebook after notebook. I had stacks of journals. And I wrote about our life together, about everything, about the death, about the death, about the death, and about the death some more. And I kept trying to make sense of it. Why had he drowned? Why couldn't he? He was a strong swimmer. Why? And I would replay that script again, trying to imagine what it was like, asking the questions, pages of what was rumination, going over and over and over the same territory. Rumination is not good. Rumination is not healing. So the cautionary note is, if you find yourself when you're writing alone, going over and over and over the same territory and feeling worse, stop writing and find someone to talk to, always. Okay, so let's talk about how you can start using expressive writing for your own purposes, and also a little bit about writing alone and writing together. Writing alone, this is Pennebaker's model, actually, of how to get started writing alone and a way to use expressive writing. Remember, not all writing is expressive writing. We have academic writing, we have writing to prepare for things, we have all kinds of letter writing. But when you're working on writing and health, working through tough times by writing, here's how to do it. First, you want to find a quiet place. place where you will not be interrupted. Okay? No music, none of those things, just quiet. Give yourself, set the timer for no more than 15 minutes. You can even start with smaller. If you're finding it hard to write, then start with 5 minutes and then gradually increase it, but take it to 15. This is when you're first starting out. And for 15 minutes, write. Don't stop to edit. Don't stop to think. Don't stop. Just start and go until the timer stops. And when it stops, then read over what you've written. Start to underline words and phrases that stand out, because those are what we call doors in to the deeper story. And you can use those same phrases the next morning or the next afternoon when you write again. Set the timer for 15 minutes. Now start with one of those phrases from the day before. And again, keep writing. The wonderful poet William Stafford used to tell his students in his poetry classes, lay a line across the page and then follow it. And that's what you do in expressive writing. You let the writing take you wherever it wants, because believe me, there is gold in those lines, whatever you've written, but don't stop for that full 15 minutes. And try to do that 3 or 4 days a week. Okay. If you want to write longer and more, yes, go ahead. But very often it's kind of hard to get started at first. So 3 or 4 days in a row, read and always reflect on your writing. What came out of it? What surprises you? Later, but much later, you could go back and use this writing that you've done as raw material for memoir, for poetry, for letters, for other ways of expressing yourself, but not right away. Right away, it's important to write freely and without any idea where it's going to take you. Okay, next slide. I mentioned before that writing can open up creative potential in you and creative activity. So when you write alone, we call it journaling, but journaling where you specifically use the expressive writing model. Where can it take you? It can take you to all kinds of ways of creating a journal. For both creative writing, trying things out that you want, like working on a poem or writing about personal experiences because you want to remember them. It can become a gratitude journal. We know that gratitude, if you stop each day to just write 3 or 5 things you're grateful for, that it's good for your mental and physical health. Gratitude is another healing aspect of the human experience. It might become an art journal. You can see some examples here where you start to use collage and sketches and also some writing on the pages. Writing can turn into a blog. Many people use personal blogs to write about their medical experiences or other experiences. It could be a reading journal. Maybe you get interested in books and you want to make notes about them. Poetry, for example. During COVID, my husband, who's always been the more analytical of the two of us, began reading my entire poetry collection. I don't know, 125 books, different poets. I was surprised. He never seemed to like poetry before. But suddenly, in this crazy time of isolation and anxiety and all the things COVID has brought to our lives, and none of it welcome, he began reading poetry. And now he reads poetry every morning and he makes notes on the poem he read. And so he has, in effect, a poetry journal. He even has written me a couple of very nice poems. An art journal, a project journal, a photo, old family photos are wonderful ways to tell stories. Use the photo and Tell the story about what you see in it. It's a wonderful way of capturing history. I have a lot of stories that are partly finished that I keep wanting to finish for my grandchildren, so that one day when they ask the questions, what was it like, Grandma, when you were a little girl? I can tell them. I won't have forgotten. Okay. So writing also opens up your creative possibilities. But first, you write for health. Okay, next slide. How do you get started? A lot of people say, well, I just stare at the blank page. Well, I can tell you from personal experience, a blank page is pretty darned intimidating. And so what we use in the creative writing and the expressive writing groups, and what I suggest you use, are prompts. What are prompts? Well, they can actually be just about anything. The poet Billy Collins uses as his prompt, looking out the window. Somebody asked him once in a poetry reading, you know, Billy Collins, what do you want to be remembered for? He's a wonderful, funny poet. And he said, I'd like to be remembered as the guy who looked out the window for his inspiration. That's a prompt. But you can use prompts like some of the ones you see here, any of them, in fact, what the doctor said. Some days I feel so upset that writing a rant is one way to get it out. You know, if things have not gone well or something's gone awry, or a couple of years ago, our upstairs neighbor left her faucets on and flooded us out on our floor. I wrote a rant about that. I was much nicer when I saw her because of that. What gives you hope? What frustrates you? What makes you angry? Or simply, today I'm thinking about, and keep writing. There are tons of books on prompts. I also have a blog that's available to anybody, whenlifehurtswriting.ca. Every couple of weeks, I post a short thematic reflection, and with it, several writing suggestions. But a prompt can get you going, and a prompt can lead to surprises. Years ago, I was in a writing group, and my father had died just not long before. And the family dynamics among my siblings and my mother were frankly terrible. And it was a painful time. And in the writing group, the leader said, write about a kitchen. A kitchen. Okay, well, I wrote about my grandmother's kitchen, my father's mother, because when I was in kindergarten, every day after school, I'd go over there, and there'd always be these wonderful smells. She was a baker. Chocolate cake, because she knew Dad was dropping by later and that was his favorite. Berry pies, cinnamon, cloves, these wonderful spices in the air. And for me, warm oatmeal raisin cookies. And then we'd sit down at a little table with the oilcloth, and I'd get to dip my cookie in her coffee. To this day, I love milky coffee. To this day, I love oatmeal and raisin cookies. But I wrote about these things. And then the group leader said, you have 30 seconds left. So I wrote my final line without thinking. When it came to reading aloud, I read it. And it was fine. It was lovely. A lot of people were smiling. And then I got to the last line. I didn't know I'd written this. My last line was, I've never felt as loved since. That was worth digging deeper. But I surprised myself. So the most benign prompt can lead you places that you need to go. Okay. Next slide. So one last writing exercise. I'll give you 5 minutes for this. There's a wonderful poem by the poet Rita Dove called Dawn Revisited. And this is the beginning line. Imagine you wake up with a second chance. Well, some of you have already been given a second chance. What was that like? Some of you may be waiting for a second chance. There may be other things going on in your life or your loved ones' lives where you wish you could have a do-over. So take the line, imagine you wake up with a second chance, and write about that second chance, that waiting for that second chance? What would it be like? 5 minutes, go ahead. Just take 30 more seconds to finish the last sentence you're on. Okay. So would anyone who hasn't shared at this point be willing to read what you have written? Just unmute yourself and say, yes, I'll read, or okay. Well, hopefully you found something to write about on the prompt. And I will say to you that in the group, which we'll talk about in just a second, it's quite often that when we for the first couple of sessions that we meet together to write, people are very reluctant to read out loud. Writing is a courageous act. Reading out loud feels twice as courageous. But once we start to share the stories, which is so important in healing, by the end of the series, everyone is reading out loud. But it's not uncommon to feel a little hesitant at first. Okay, next slide, Paula. So just a couple of words about the writing together in a group. In an expressive writing group, it is facilitated by a group leader who is knowledgeable about counseling and group work and expressive writing, because it's important to create an atmosphere of safety and support at once. The group size of the groups I'm running right now, virtually because of COVID, is limited. Typically in COVID, we have between 12 and 15 participants. Face-to-face, I take up to 15 at any given time. The workshops run from 6 to 8 weeks, weekly. All writing is done in the group using prompts that I give, and all writing is timed. And why timed? Because you don't stop to overthink what you're writing. And that's when you stumble on to insights and things that are very important. There's always the opportunity to read out loud. It's never required that you do read out loud. When someone reads out loud, we honor simply what is given, and it's always affirmative. What I liked in your writing was, and one statement. We never critique, we never interpret, and we never respond by saying, oh, you wrote about your transplant. Well, when I had mine, responding with our own experience, not allowed. The writing groups, why are they important? Because stories shared are how we connect with each other. Shared stories are how we make sense of things ourselves. It offers comfort, support. We discover we are not alone in our struggles, and it's an extraordinary experience for me to be witness to the sharing, both the writing of and the reading of and the sharing of stories. Leslie Marmon Silko, an Indigenous American writer, in a wonderful book called Storyteller, said, I will tell you something about stories. They aren't just entertainment. They are all we have to fight off illness and death. You don't have anything if you don't have stories. I love that quote. And so it's why I often say to anyone who comes to my group or in a presentation like this, if you don't tell your story, who will? Okay, any questions before I close? Anyone? Happy to answer anything that's come up. Gosh, I guess that means I have just done a wonderful job of explaining. Well, I hope so.
Oh no! Wait! I was trying to.
All right, Carl, you're my one faithful. Go for it.
I was trying to find my mute button, but I found it. This was very, very inspirational. I've done a lot of things through my life, and of course, my favorite work was technology. I worked for the Imperial Oil, IBM, and I thought I thought that was it. You know, the only other thing I could think of was maybe being a doctor. But what we've experienced here today, right? It's something, you know, you hear about people writing books and all kinds of things, but the way this touched me, it's more because, you know, we had something, like, for example, in my case, my kidney transplant, right? I have so many things to say about it, how it affected me.
You have a
Right.
story to tell.
Yeah, you know, and so you've given me a little bit of some hooks, and
Good.
when and you know, and we've written about ourselves before, you know, but not with the little kind of little. You've added some. How can I say? You added a little. What they call it? Icing, sugar on the cake with a little cherry on top. You
Well,
see,
thank
because
you, Pearl.
yeah,
Thank you.
because I mean, we can all just.
I need to interrupt you only in the interest of time, and I apologize for that. But
Okay.
I'm watching my clock, and I have three or 4 minutes left to say anything. So I'll just wrap up, because if you want to write more,
Yes.
as you so clearly do, well,
Yes.
you know, invest in a notebook. That's number one, and don't just get any old thing. I've been writing in the same notebook for years. It's not right at my side. It's over across the room. It's a leather cover, and I just stick hard journals in it. But this is important because this is your story, your life, and give it some TLC and some special care. Also,
absolutely.
Here are some resources. If you're interested in learning more about expressive writing and writing as a way of healing, James Pennebaker and his colleague Joshua Smythe have written a wonderful little book. It's very, very readable, that talks about all the research and all the findings. And it's a beautiful sort of primer on expressive writing. Luis de Salvo, another great book that I adore, Writing as a Way of Healing, How Telling Our Stories Transforms Our Lives. She is an English professor, so she comes at it from a different perspective. She talks about Pennebaker's research, but then she gives example of great artists and writers who wrote or created great art out of those painful life experiences. It's very, very beautiful little book. Writing Down the Bones, a classic, a standard. It's been reprinted. Natalie Goldberg, lots of prompts and things, suggestions in there. Journal to the Self is about expressive writing and journaling. It's a more structured approach, but Kay Adams is the expert on journal therapy. And finally, a little book that I just stumbled onto lately called 3-Minute Journaling. Little prompts, a booklet of little prompts, and all you do is write in response to the prompt for 3 minutes. But if you go on Amazon, you'll find a bazillion of, well, maybe not a bazillion, but a lot of books and material on expressive writing. So in closing, let me leave you with a couple of quotes. These are two of my favorite. Natalie Goldberg says, and I second and third this, all of us have a story to tell. And I always ask my group, if you don't tell your story, then who will? Okay, tell your story. And finally, Dorothy Allison, in her wonderful little memoir called 2 or 3 Things I Know for Sure. One of the things she knows for sure, I am the only one who can tell the story of my life and say what it means. And the same for you. You are the only one who can tell your story of what has happened to you and tell us what it means. I want to thank you to Paula for inviting me to give this talk. Thanks to you who attended today and gave me your time and listening. And thank you. It's always a pleasure. I hope you will write and tell your stories too, because I've looked at some of them that Paula referred to me, and they are very inspiring. Thank you, everybody. And Paula, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Sharon. This was a wonderful, wonderful session. And it was wonderful for many reasons. First of all, we all learned quite a bit more about expressive writing. And I think it also allowed us an opportunity to reflect on our own experiences and our own lives and important aspects that we may not have really thought about before, and that may shed light on ways that we can help others, that we can help ourselves. I particularly appreciated your sharing of your personal journey, and also Mr. Hicks for sharing his stories as well. It is important that we do this. It's important for ourselves. It's important for those around us. It's important for others who may be going through similar paths and may not know where to turn. All of us can learn from each other and can learn through reflection and writing. So thank you everyone for joining us. We look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. And Sharon, thanks again.
Thanks all. Thank you very much. That was fantastic.